the autumn of 1898, the remote logging town of Bitterwood, Washington, welcomed two new residents with the quiet enthusiasm reserved for those who brought useful skills to an unforgiving wilderness. The Pendleton brothers, Elias and Silas, opened their butchery on Main Street with little fanfare, their clean aprons and sharp knives promising fresh meat to a community that had grown weary of salted pork and questionable game. What the townsfolk could not have imagined was that their new neighbors harbored a secret so profound, so utterly grotesque, that it would transform their quiet mountain settlement into something far more sinister than any ghost story whispered around winter fires. For 15 years, the brothers would serve their community with dedication and skill. Their meat was tender, flavorful, unlike anything the locals had ever tasted. They called it their special stock, sourced from their family's remote homestead high in the mountains, and it became the pride of every dinner table in town. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. But in the winter of 1913, when a search party finally climbed the treacherous mountain pass to investigate a string of disappearances, they would discover that the Pendleton brothers had not been feeding their community at all. They had been feeding on it. This was not just crime. This was an operation that fed on human lives for decades. The photograph is faded now, sepia-toned and cracked at the edges, but it still captures the essence of what Bitterwood's Main Street looked like in the early 1900s. Snow dusts the wooden sidewalks, and smoke rises from a dozen chimneys into the gray Pacific Northwest sky. At the center of the frame stands a modest building with a painted sign that reads, "Pendleton Brothers, Quality Meats." The windows are clean, the door freshly painted, and two figures in white aprons stand proudly beside their establishment, smiling for the camera. What the photographer could not capture, what no one in Bitterwood could have possibly understood at that moment, was that they were documenting the face of an operation so methodical, so utterly depraved, that it would redefine their understanding of evil itself. For 15 years, from 1898 to 1913, Elias and Silas Pendleton would serve their community with unwavering dedication. They would provide the finest cuts of meat anyone in the mountain territories had ever tasted. Their customers would praise the tenderness, the rich flavor, the way their special stock seemed to melt on the tongue like butter. The sound of their cleaver hitting the cutting board became as familiar as the morning whistle from the sawmill. Housewives would line up outside their shop every Tuesday when the fresh delivery arrived from the brothers' family homestead high in the mountains. Children would press their faces against the window, watching Elias wrap parcels in brown paper with the careful precision of a craftsman. The meat was expensive but worth every penny. It was, as the brothers would tell anyone who asked, sourced exclusively from their own private stock. But private stock, as the town would eventually learn, was not what they imagined it to be. The animals being processed in the remote mountain homestead, known as the Eyrie, were not cattle or pigs. They were not sheep or deer or any creature that walked on four legs. The supply chain that fed Bitterwood's dinner tables for over a decade had been harvesting something far more precious, far more forbidden. The brothers had been serving their neighbors the flesh of missing travelers, vanished laborers, and most horrifying of all, members of their own inbred family. How did two quiet butchers orchestrate a feast of horrors right under the town's nose? To understand how such an unspeakable horror could unfold undetected for 15 years, one must first understand the geography that made it possible. Bitterwood was not merely isolated, it was forgotten. Nestled in a valley between towering peaks of the Cascade Range, the town existed as a single point of civilization in an ocean of old-growth forest that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The nearest railroad stop lay 40 miles to the south, connected by a logging road that became impassable during the winter months. When the snows came, Bitterwood became an island unto itself, cut off from the outside world for months at a time. The town itself consisted of perhaps 24 buildings clustered around the sawmill that gave the settlement its reason for existence. Main Street was a muddy thoroughfare lined with a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, and the small church where Reverend Abraham Clark delivered his Sunday sermons to a congregation that rarely exceeded 30 souls. At the south end of town stood the Pendleton brothers' butchery, a modest wooden structure that had been built specifically for their trade, complete with a cold storage room carved into the hillside behind the building. But 20 miles north of Bitterwood, accessible only by a treacherous mountain pass that wound its way through terrain so forbidding that even experienced loggers avoided it during bad weather, sat the Pendleton family homestead. The locals called it the Eyrie, though few had ever seen it with their own eyes. According to the brothers, it had been in their family for generations, a sprawling property where their clan raised livestock and lived according to the old ways, suspicious of outsiders and content with their isolation. The journey from town to the Eyrie required a full day's hard riding, following a path that was little more than deer trails and rock ledges. The route climbed steadily through dense forest, across rushing streams, and over ridges where a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling into ravines so deep that their bodies would never be recovered. It was a journey that few townspeople had any reason to attempt, and those who did venture into the high country rarely traveled as far as the Pendleton homestead. This geographical schism created two distinct worlds, two separate realities that operated according to different rules. In Bitterwood, the Pendleton brothers were respected members of the community, known for their quality merchandise and fair dealing. But at the Eyrie, 20 miles away and 1,000 feet higher in elevation, an entirely different operation was taking place. The isolation was not merely physical but psychological, creating a barrier between civilization and something far more primitive, far more dangerous. This geographical schism was the first clue everyone missed. In a community where trust was earned through consistency and reputation built on daily interactions, Elias and Silas Pendleton had achieved something remarkable. They were not merely tolerated as newcomers, they were embraced as essential pillars of Bitterwood society. Their success lay not in grand gestures or elaborate schemes, but in the quiet reliability of their daily routine, the unassuming competence that marked them as men worthy of respect in a place where survival depended on knowing your neighbors. Elias, the elder brother by 3 years, possessed the kind of natural charm that made customers feel valued rather than merely served. He stood behind the counter each morning at precisely 7 o'clock, his apron spotless, his knives arranged with military precision on the wooden block beside the scale. When housewives entered his shop, he would greet them by name, inquire about their families, and offer suggestions for the evening meal based on what looked particularly fresh that day. His hands, though stained with the inevitable marks of his trade, were always clean when he handled money or wrapped packages in brown paper tied with string. Silas presented a stark contrast to his brother's easy sociability. Massive in build, with shoulders that filled door frames and hands that could snap bones without apparent effort, he rarely spoke more than a few words to customers. His domain was the back room where the actual butchering took place, where sides of beef were broken down into steaks and roasts, where the sound of his cleaver created a rhythmic percussion that became as familiar as church bells to the residents of Main Street. Yet, despite his intimidating presence, children were never afraid of Silas. He would slip them small pieces of jerky when their mothers were not looking, his severe expression softening into something approaching gentleness. The brothers complemented each other with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Elias handled the customers, the money, the social obligations that came with running a business in a small town. Silas handled the meat, the deliveries, the physical labor that their trade required. Neither seemed capable of existing without the other, and indeed, no one in Bitterwood could recall ever seeing one brother without the other somewhere nearby. Their personal lives remained respectfully private, as was considered proper for unmarried men of their station. They lived in a small apartment above the shop, attended church every Sunday, and contributed generously to community causes. When pressed about their family at the Eyrie, they spoke with evident affection about their aging relatives, explaining that the old folks preferred their mountain solitude and rarely came to town. The brothers served as intermediaries between two worlds, carrying news and supplies up the mountain pass and bringing down the products of their family's livestock operation. The quality of their meat set them apart from any competition. Customers would travel from neighboring settlements to purchase Pendleton beef, which possessed a tenderness and flavor that seemed impossible to replicate. When asked about their methods, Elias would smile and speak vaguely about old family traditions, special feeding techniques passed down through generations, the benefits of high-altitude grazing and pure mountain water. It was, he would insist, simply a matter of treating livestock with proper care and attention. They were the last people anyone would suspect, which was their greatest asset. The first disappearance happened on a Tuesday morning in November of 1899, exactly 13 months after the Pendleton brothers had opened their shop on Main Street. A railroad construction worker named Patrick Murphy, who had been boarding at the local inn while his crew laid track through the mountain passes, simply failed to appear for breakfast. His bed had been slept in, his few possessions remained undisturbed in his room, but Murphy himself had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. Sheriff John Hale conducted what passed for an investigation in those days, interviewing the other railroad workers and checking the obvious places where a man might meet misfortune. The saloon keeper confirmed that Murphy had been drinking the night before, but not excessively. The boarding house owner reported nothing unusual. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication that violence had occurred. The most logical explanation, the one that satisfied everyone, including the sheriff, was that Murphy had simply decided to move on without notice, as transient laborers often did when the work grew hard or the pay was disappointing. Within a week, the railroad crew had departed for their next project, taking with them any lingering questions about Murphy's fate. The incident might have been forgotten entirely, filed away as one of those minor mysteries that accumulate in small towns like dust on neglected shelves, except for one curious coincidence that few people noticed and fewer still thought worthy of comment. 3 days after Murphy's disappearance, the Pendleton brothers announced the arrival of a fresh shipment from their family homestead. The timing was unusual, as their normal deliveries occurred on the first Monday of each month, and they had received their regular supply less than 2 weeks earlier. When questioned about the unexpected bounty, Elias explained that one of their prize bulls had suffered an injury and needed to be slaughtered before the meat spoiled. Rather than waste such excellent beef, the family had decided to send it to town immediately. The meat that appeared in the Pendleton shop that week was indeed exceptional, even by their already impressive standards. Customers remarked on its unusual tenderness, the way it seemed to melt under the knife, the rich flavor that lingered on the tongue long after the meal had ended. Several regular patrons declared it the finest beef they had ever tasted, and word spread quickly through the small community about the brothers' latest offering. By the time Murphy's absence became official, recorded in Sheriff Hale's ledger as a missing person who had likely moved on to seek work elsewhere, the exceptional beef had been consumed and forgotten. The two events existed in separate compartments of the town's collective memory, unconnected by anything more substantial than coincidence. After all, what possible relationship could exist between a drifting laborer and a family's livestock operation 20 miles away in the mountains? It was a pattern that would repeat for over a decade, each time explained away a little easier than the last. By 1905, the reputation of Pendleton beef had spread far beyond the boundaries of Bitterwood itself. Loggers working camps throughout the Cascade Range would speak in reverent terms about the meat served in the remote mountain town, describing flavors and textures that seemed to transcend ordinary butchery. Word traveled along the railroad lines, through the saloons and boarding houses, where transient workers gathered to share information about the best places to find work, decent food, and fair treatment. The phenomenon created an unexpected economic advantage for Bitterwood. Men seeking employment would specifically request assignment to logging operations in the area, not merely for the work itself, but for the opportunity to experience what had become legendary among their ranks. Letters sent home to wives and families invariably mentioned the exceptional quality of the local cuisine, particularly the beef served at the town's only restaurant, which sourced its meat exclusively from the Pendleton brothers. One such letter, discovered years later among the personal effects of a lumberjack named Thomas Wright, captured the almost mystical reverence that surrounded the brothers' special stock. Wright wrote to his brother in Oregon, describing his first meal in Bitterwood with the enthusiasm of a man who had discovered religion. The meat, he claimed, possessed a tenderness and flavor unlike anything he had encountered in 20 years of working camps from California to the Canadian border. It was, he insisted, worth the difficult journey to this isolated settlement just to experience it once. The economic impact was undeniable. The boarding house expanded to accommodate the influx of workers who specifically sought employment in the Bitterwood area. The saloon prospered as men celebrated their good fortune at securing positions that would allow them regular access to such exceptional fare. Even the general store benefited, as workers were willing to pay premium prices for provisions in a town that offered such remarkable culinary rewards. The Pendleton brothers handled their growing fame with characteristic humility. When complimented on their product, Elias would deflect credit to the family's traditional methods and the superior grazing conditions in the high mountains. He spoke of generations of careful breeding, of livestock that roamed freely through pristine alpine meadows, of slaughtering techniques that had been perfected over decades of practice. The meat was expensive, he acknowledged, but such quality demanded appropriate compensation. More disturbing in retrospect was how the town's collective appetite began to override other considerations. When workers disappeared, as they occasionally did, the primary concern was not their welfare, but whether their absence might somehow affect the steady supply of meat that had become central to Bitterwood's identity. The community had developed what could only be described as a psychological dependency on the Pendleton brothers' exceptional product. The town's stomach had long overruled its conscience. Before we continue with this disturbing tale, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button if you find yourself drawn to these dark corners of history that most would prefer to forget. The operation that sustained Bitterwood's appetite for 15 years was not the product of madness or spontaneous violence, but rather a methodical system as precise as any industrial enterprise. Like all successful businesses, it required careful planning, division of labor, and attention to the details that separated amateur efforts from professional results. The Pendleton brothers had created what amounted to a supply chain of human flesh, complete with procurement, processing, and distribution networks that functioned with terrifying efficiency. Elias handled what might charitably be called customer acquisition. His role required him to identify suitable targets among the transient population that regularly passed through Bitterwood seeking work or temporary shelter. The ideal candidate was a man traveling alone, without local connections or family members who might inquire about his whereabouts. Railroad workers, itinerant loggers, and seasonal laborers made perfect subjects for his attention, as their disappearances could easily be attributed to the rootless nature of their employment. The selection process was not random, but carefully considered. Elias would engage potential victims in casual conversation, learning about their backgrounds, their destinations, their connections to the outside world. Men who mentioned expecting letters from relatives, or who had arranged to meet associates in nearby towns, were generally allowed to continue their journeys unmolested. But those who spoke of being truly alone, of having severed ties with their previous lives, of seeking fresh starts in territories where no one knew their names, these men would receive special attention from the charming elder Pendleton brother. The procurement itself was handled with clinical precision. Elias would invite selected individuals to accompany him on supply runs to the family homestead, describing the journey as an opportunity to see the source of the famous beef and perhaps purchase meat directly from the producers at reduced prices. He spoke of the scenic beauty of the mountain passes, the hospitality of his family, the possibility of securing employment at the remote ranch during the coming season. The ride to the Eyrie took a full day, following treacherous mountain paths that were known only to the Pendleton family. By the time visitors realized that the journey had taken them far beyond any hope of rescue or escape, it was far too late to reconsider their decision. At the Eyrie, Silas assumed responsibility for what the brothers would later describe as processing operations. The remote homestead had been specifically configured for their needs, with outbuildings that served functions far removed from traditional farming or ranching. The main barn contained equipment that bore disturbing similarities to the tools of his trade in town, but scaled for larger operations and designed for tasks that required absolute privacy. Visitors who arrived at the mountain compound alive would not remain so for long, and their bodies would be treated with the same professional attention that Silas applied to more conventional livestock in his shop. The transformation from victim to product required specialized knowledge and equipment. Silas had developed techniques for efficient butchering that maximized yield while minimizing waste, treating human remains with the same methodical approach he applied to beef cattle. The process was conducted in sterile conditions, with proper refrigeration and storage methods that ensured the final product would meet the quality standards that Bitterwood customers had come to expect from the Pendleton name. The distribution network was perhaps the most sophisticated element of their operation. Processed meat would be transported down the mountain pass in wagons loaded with ice and wrapped packages, appearing identical to legitimate shipments from any remote ranch. Regular delivery schedules maintained the appearance of normal commercial activity, while careful rationing ensured that supply never exceeded what could be consumed locally without raising questions about the source. The brothers maintained meticulous records of their operations, tracking inventory with the precision of experienced merchants. Their system was flawless, until the line between supply and family began to blur. By the autumn of 1912, Reverend Abraham Clark had served the spiritual needs of Bitterwood for nearly a decade, delivering sermons to the same faces week after week, presiding over the occasional wedding or funeral, and providing what comfort he could to a community that lived perpetually on the edge of hardship and isolation. He was not a man given to wild speculation or supernatural fears, but rather the sort of practical clergyman who understood that his congregation needed guidance grounded in observable reality rather than abstract theology. It was this practical nature that made his growing unease about the disappearances all the more significant. Unlike the other residents of Bitterwood, who seemed content to accept convenient explanations for the vanishing of transient workers. Clark had begun to notice patterns that troubled his methodical mind. Men would arrive in town seeking work, take rooms at the boarding house, purchase supplies at the general store, and then simply cease to exist as if they had never drawn breath at all. The frequency was what first caught his attention. In larger cities, the disappearance of rootless individuals might pass unnoticed among thousands of residents, but in a community of fewer than 50 souls, the regular vanishing of visitors created ripples that should have been impossible to ignore. Yet somehow his neighbors seemed remarkably capable of forgetting these incidents almost as quickly as they occurred, their memories apparently clouded by explanations that satisfied no one who examined them closely. More disturbing still was the timing of these disappearances in relation to the arrival of fresh meat at the Pendleton shop. Clark had not initially intended to track such correlations, but his habit of maintaining detailed records for church activities had made him acutely aware of dates and schedules throughout the community. When he began to compare his notes about missing persons with his observations of the brothers' delivery schedule, the pattern that emerged left him physically nauseated. The final catalyst for his suspicions was the disappearance of Thomas Finch in late October of 1912. Unlike the typical transient laborers who vanished without trace, Finch was a local man, the son of a family that had lived in the area for 3 generations. He had been employed at the sawmill for over 2 years, attended church regularly, and was engaged to marry the daughter of the boarding house proprietor the following spring. His disappearance could not be dismissed with the usual explanations about restless workers seeking opportunities elsewhere. Clark approached Sheriff Hale on a gray November morning, finding the lawman in his office, consuming what appeared to be an exceptionally fine breakfast of steak and eggs. The Reverend expressed his concerns about the coincidences he had observed, the troubling pattern of disappearances followed by the arrival of fresh meat from the Pendleton homestead. He suggested that perhaps an investigation of the area might provide answers to questions that had been troubling the community for years. The sheriff's response was telling in ways that Clark would not fully appreciate until much later. Hale dismissed the Reverend's concerns with the weary patience of a man who had heard too many wild theories from anxious citizens. He pointed out that the Pendleton brothers were respected members of the community who had never given anyone cause for suspicion. Their meat was expensive precisely because it was of superior quality, sourced from livestock raised under ideal conditions in the mountain pastures. The timing of deliveries was dictated by practical considerations of transportation and preservation, not by any sinister design. As Clark left the sheriff's office that morning, he could not shake the impression that Hale's dismissal of his concerns had been unusually emphatic, almost defensive. It would be months before he realized that the sheriff's loyalty to the Pendleton brothers might have been influenced by more than professional respect. The Reverend's doubts were dismissed, but they lingered in the air like a bad smell. The pressure that finally forced Sheriff John Hale to act came not from his own conscience, but from forces beyond his control. Thomas Finch's disappearance had created ripples that extended far beyond Bitterwood's isolated boundaries, reaching family members in distant towns who possessed both the resources and determination to demand answers. Finch's brother, a successful merchant from Seattle, had hired private investigators and threatened to involve federal authorities if local law enforcement continued to treat his siblings' vanishing as a matter of casual indifference. By early December of 1913, Hale found himself facing the kind of outside scrutiny that small-town sheriffs feared most. Questions were being asked by people with connections to territorial officials, individuals who possessed the authority to review his handling of multiple disappearances over more than a decade. His comfortable arrangement with the Pendleton brothers, his willingness to accept convenient explanations for inconvenient mysteries, was about to be subjected to examination by parties who had no investment in preserving the status quo. The sheriff's reluctance to investigate the area was evident to anyone who observed his preparations for the journey. He delayed the expedition for 3 days, citing concerns about weather conditions and the need to assemble proper equipment for the treacherous mountain passage. When he finally announced his intention to visit the Pendleton homestead, he took care to inform Elias of his plans, explaining that outside pressure had made the visit necessary, but that he expected it to be little more than a formality that would satisfy distant relatives and territorial bureaucrats. The area that greeted the search party was not the bustling family compound that Elias Pendleton had described in his conversations with townspeople over the years. Instead, they found a collection of buildings that appeared to have been hastily abandoned, with doors left standing open and personal belongings scattered as if their owners had fled in considerable haste. The silence was profound and unnatural, broken only by the sound of wind through the mountain pines and the occasional creak of unsecured shutters moving against their hinges. What struck the investigators immediately was the overwhelming smell of lye that seemed to permeate every structure on the property. The caustic odor was so intense that several members of the search party were forced to cover their faces with handkerchiefs to avoid being overcome by the chemical fumes. Deputy Morrison, who had experience with various forms of industrial cleaning, observed that the quantity of lye required to produce such a pervasive smell would be enormous, far exceeding what any normal household might require for routine cleaning purposes. The chemical had been used in such massive quantities that it had soaked into the wooden floors and walls, creating an atmosphere that burned the throat and made breathing difficult. The main house revealed signs of recent habitation, but also evidence of hurried departure. Meals had been left half-finished on tables with portions of what appeared to be meat still congealing on plates beside overturned cups of coffee. Clothing remained scattered across bedroom floors, and personal items lay abandoned as if their owners had fled in the middle of daily activities. Yet, despite these signs of hasty evacuation, the house contained surprisingly few personal belongings for a family compound that supposedly housed multiple generations of Pendleton relatives. The outbuildings presented an even more disturbing picture. What should have been barns and storage sheds had been converted into facilities that bore uncomfortable similarities to commercial slaughterhouses. Hooks hung from ceiling beams, drainage channels had been carved into concrete floors, and tables bore stains that no amount of lye could completely eliminate. The private investigators documented everything with their cameras, creating a photographic record of spaces that had clearly been designed for purposes far removed from traditional farming or ranching. It was Reverend Clark who made the discovery that would transform their understanding of the entire situation. While examining what appeared to be the main family office, he noticed a leather-bound ledger that had been carelessly left open on a wooden desk near the window. The book appeared to be a record-keeping system of some kind, filled with columns of dates, names, and numerical entries that initially suggested nothing more sinister than routine business transactions. The handwriting was neat and methodical, suggesting an author who took considerable pride in maintaining accurate records. But as Clark examined the entries more carefully, patterns began to emerge that chilled him to his core. The dates in the ledger corresponded precisely with the disappearances he had been tracking in his own records, while the names included several individuals he recognized as missing persons from Bitterwood and surrounding communities. Thomas Murphy, the railroad worker who had vanished in 1899, was listed with a date that matched his disappearance exactly. Thomas Finch, whose vanishing had prompted this investigation, appeared as the most recent entry, dated just 6 weeks earlier. More horrifying still were the numerical columns that accompanied each name. The figures appeared to represent weights and measurements, recorded with the precision of a professional merchant tracking inventory. Each human name was followed by what could only be interpreted as yield calculations, the sort of data that a butcher might maintain when processing livestock for commercial sale. The ledger transformed missing persons into units of production, reducing human beings to pounds of usable product with the clinical detachment of a business ledger. Sheriff Hale, reading over the Reverend's shoulder, felt his legs grow weak as the implications of the discovery became clear. The document represented not merely evidence of murder, but proof of a systematic operation that had been converting human beings into merchandise for over a decade. Every name in the ledger corresponded to a person whose disappearance he had dismissed, whose fate he had chosen to ignore in favor of convenient explanations that allowed him to continue enjoying the exceptional meat that the Pendleton brothers provided. The numbers told a story more terrifying than any ghost tale. The party that set out for the Eyrie on the morning of December 15th consisted of Sheriff Hale, his deputy Samuel Morrison, Reverend Clark, who had insisted on accompanying them, and 2 private investigators hired by the Finch family. The ride up the mountain pass was conducted in near silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about what they might find at their destination. The weather was crisp but clear, ideal conditions for travel, eliminating any possibility of using natural obstacles as an excuse to postpone the investigation. The Pendleton homestead, when they finally reached it after 8 hours of hard riding, presented an appearance that was both rustic and oddly unsettling. The main house was larger than most had expected, a rambling structure that seemed to have grown organically over several decades, rather than following any coherent architectural plan. Outbuildings were scattered across the property in arrangements that suggested practical considerations rather than aesthetic concerns. Smoke rose from several chimneys, indicating that the property was inhabited despite its remote location. Elias Pendleton met the search party at the main gate, his manner displaying the perfect balance of surprise and hospitality that one might expect from a man receiving unexpected visitors at his isolated mountain retreat. He expressed concern about the purpose of their visit, explaining that his family was unaccustomed to strangers and might be disturbed by the presence of so many outsiders. When Sheriff Hale explained the necessity of investigating reports about missing persons, Elias nodded with understanding but requested that the search be conducted with appropriate discretion to avoid frightening the elderly relatives who comprised the bulk of the mountain community. The Reverend later described the moment when their small party approached the main house as one of the most unsettling experiences of his life. Something about the property felt fundamentally wrong, though he struggled to identify specific details that justified his unease. The buildings appeared normal, the grounds were well maintained, and the Pendleton family members they encountered seemed appropriately respectful of their unexpected visitors. As the sheriff pushed past Elias Pendleton, he had no idea what door he was truly about to open. The search party's discovery of the ledger had transformed what began as a routine investigation into something far more urgent and dangerous. Sheriff Hale, despite his previous reluctance to pursue the matter, understood that they now possessed evidence of crimes so heinous that immediate action was required. The question was no longer whether the Pendleton brothers were guilty of wrongdoing, but rather how many people had died to satisfy their grotesque enterprise and where the perpetrators might have fled. Deputy Morrison organized the search of the remaining outbuildings, while the private investigators continued documenting evidence with their cameras. What they found in the converted barn behind the main house exceeded even their darkest expectations. The structure had been systematically modified to serve as a processing facility. Complete with pulleys for moving heavy loads, drainage systems for disposing of liquids, and storage areas that reeked of decay despite obvious attempts at thorough cleaning with lye. As darkness began to fall across the mountain compound, the investigators prepared to make camp for the night before beginning their descent to Bitterwood the following morning. They had collected more than enough evidence to justify arrests and had documented the scene thoroughly for presentation to territorial authorities. The case against the Pendleton brothers appeared to be overwhelming, assuming the fugitives could be located and apprehended. It was then that they heard the sound of approaching horses echoing through the mountain passes. The rhythmic clatter of hooves on stone grew steadily louder, suggesting multiple riders making their way up the treacherous path to the eyrie. Sheriff Hale called for silence, and the search party took positions that would allow them to observe whoever was approaching without immediately revealing their own presence. Elias and Silas Pendleton emerged from the forest shadows like specters returning to a familiar haunting ground. They rode slowly, apparently unaware that their compound had been discovered and searched. In the fading light, their faces appeared gaunt and desperate, as if the past few days of flight had stripped away the genial masks they had worn in town for so many years. When they realized that their homestead had been invaded, the brothers' reaction was swift and violent. Silas, the massive younger brother who had always remained silent in town, produced a hunting rifle from his saddle scabbard and began firing at the outbuildings where he suspected the intruders might be hiding. His shots were wild and inaccurate, but they shattered the evening silence and sent the search party scrambling for better cover. Elias, meanwhile, dismounted and began moving toward the main house with the fluid grace of a predator stalking wounded prey. Unlike his brother's panic-driven assault, the elder Pendleton's approach was methodical and calculated, suggesting a man who had experience with violence and understood how to use terrain to his advantage. The confrontation that followed was brief but savage. Deputy Morrison managed to outflank Silas and struck him down with the butt of his rifle, ending the younger brother's wild shooting before anyone was seriously injured. The massive man collapsed like a felled tree, his skull cracked, but his breathing still labored and regular. Elias proved more difficult to subdue. When finally cornered in the main house, surrounded by armed men with nowhere to retreat, he displayed none of the charm that had made him so popular among the citizens of Bitterwood. Instead, he spoke with the cold rationality of a businessman defending a legitimate enterprise against unreasonable interference. He explained that their operation had been nothing more than efficient use of available resources. Transient workers who disappeared were already disconnected from society, their deaths creating no meaningful loss to anyone who mattered. The meat they provided served a useful purpose, feeding families and supporting the local economy. The brothers had simply identified a market opportunity and developed the infrastructure necessary to serve it effectively. His confession was worse than any denial. The full scope of the Pendleton brothers' operation did not become clear until investigators began the painstaking process of cross-referencing the names in the eyrie ledger with missing person reports from throughout the territory. What emerged from this analysis was a pattern of disappearances that extended far beyond the transient workers who had vanished from Bitterwood over the years. The ledger contained entries that corresponded to individuals who had never been reported missing at all, people whose absence had apparently gone unnoticed by anyone in the outside world. More disturbing still was the discovery that many of the names in the ledger belonged to individuals who shared the Pendleton surname. The family tree that investigators reconstructed from county records and church documents revealed a clan that had been living in isolation for several generations, intermarrying to the point where genetic abnormalities had become commonplace among their offspring. The mountain compound had housed not merely the two brothers known to Bitterwood, but an extended family of perhaps 20 individuals whose existence had been carefully concealed from the outside world. The coroner's report on the matriarch of the clan, filed in 1905, provided crucial insight into the true nature of the Pendleton family. The document described a woman whose physical deformities were so severe that she could barely be recognized as human, with filed teeth that had been sharpened to points and bone structures that suggested generations of inbreeding. The official cause of death was listed as misadventure, but the ledger told a different story entirely. According to the meticulous records kept by Elias, the matriarch had not died of natural causes, but had been processed like any other source of meat for the family enterprise. Her entry in the ledger was accompanied by yield calculations that matched those of the missing transients, indicating that the brothers had made no distinction between family members and strangers when selecting subjects for their operation. Further analysis revealed that the Pendleton clan had been systematically culling its own members for years, apparently selecting individuals whose physical or mental defects made them unsuitable for life in their isolated community. Children born with severe abnormalities, elderly relatives who had become burdens on the family resources, and adults whose behavior might have attracted unwanted attention from outsiders had all been eliminated and converted into products for the Bitterwood market. The practice appeared to serve multiple purposes for the family. It eliminated mouths that could not contribute to the household economy, disposed of individuals whose appearance might have raised questions if they had ever been seen by outsiders, and provided a steady source of raw material for their commercial enterprise. The brothers had transformed what might have been seen as mercy killings into profit-generating activities that supported their entire operation. The psychological implications were staggering. The Pendleton family had developed a worldview in which human beings were divided into two categories: those who served useful purposes and those who represented nothing more than potential resources to be harvested when convenient. Blood relationships provided no protection from this utilitarian calculus, and the normal bonds of family affection had been replaced by considerations of efficiency and profitability. The investigation also revealed that the two brothers known to Bitterwood were not the only family members capable of functioning in normal society. Several other relatives had apparently made trips to town over the years, purchasing supplies and conducting business, while maintaining the fiction that the mountain compound housed a traditional farming family. The entire clan had been complicit in maintaining the deception that allowed their operation to continue undetected. The butchers hadn't just preyed on strangers. They had consumed their own blood. The immediate response to the discovery at the Eyrie was a collective silence that seemed to envelop Bitterwood like a heavy fog rolling in from the mountains. Citizens who had spent 15 years praising the quality of Pendleton meat suddenly found themselves unable to discuss the subject at all, as if the very words had been erased from their vocabulary. The realization that they had been unwitting participants in cannibalism created a form of psychological trauma that no one in the isolated community was equipped to process or understand. Sheriff Hale, faced with evidence that implicated not only the Pendleton brothers, but potentially the entire town as accessories to their crimes, made a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Rather than pursue a public trial that would expose Bitterwood to national scrutiny and destroy what remained of the community's reputation, he arranged for Elias and Silas to be quietly committed to the territorial asylum. The official records would show that the brothers had suffered mental breakdowns due to the isolation and hardships of mountain life, requiring indefinite medical treatment rather than criminal prosecution. The decision was supported by territorial officials who understood the political implications of a case that would inevitably attract sensational newspaper coverage and damage the region's prospects for statehood. a trial featuring testimony about cannibalism, incest, and the systematic murder of transient workers would create exactly the sort of publicity that Washington Territory could not afford as it sought recognition as a civilized and stable addition to the Union. The physical evidence of the Pendleton operation was systematically destroyed in the weeks following their capture. The airy compound was burned to the ground, with every structure reduced to ash and rubble that would eventually be reclaimed by the forest. The ledger that had provided such damning evidence of their crimes was confiscated and reportedly destroyed, though some suspected that copies had been retained in government files that would remain sealed indefinitely. Most symbolically, the Pendleton butchery in Bitterwood was also consigned to flames. The townspeople gathered on a cold January evening to watch the building burn, their faces illuminated by firelight that reflected emotions too complex for simple description. The destruction was both a purification ritual and an attempt to erase physical reminders of their collective shame, but the psychological scars would prove far more difficult to eliminate than wooden structures and incriminating documents. The official story, as reported in the Bitterwood Ledger and distributed to other regional newspapers, described a tragedy rather than a crime. The Pendleton family had apparently fallen victim to the isolation and harsh conditions of mountain life, developing peculiar behaviors that had ultimately led to their mental collapse. The disappearance of various transient workers over the years was attributed to the dangerous terrain and severe weather conditions that made travel through the mountain passes particularly hazardous during certain seasons. Children who had been born to the surviving members of the Pendleton clan were quietly adopted by families in distant communities, their origins obscured by falsified documents and their true parentage never revealed. The few family members who had not been directly involved in the cannibalistic enterprise were relocated to other territories where their connection to the area would never be discovered. The broader implications of the case were carefully suppressed through a combination of official silence and social pressure. Newspaper editors throughout the territory received informal guidance about the importance of treating the matter with appropriate discretion, while law enforcement officials were instructed to avoid creating detailed records that might eventually become public documents. The official record was cleaned up, but the truth festered in the memory of every citizen. In the digital age of the 21st century, the Pendleton case has found new life among communities of urban explorers, true crime enthusiasts, and collectors of dark folklore who trade stories and theories across internet forums dedicated to America's forgotten horrors. The remote location of the former Airy compound, now completely reclaimed by decades of forest growth, has become a pilgrimage destination for those seeking to connect with one of the Pacific Northwest's most disturbing legends. Modern hikers who venture into the high country above what was once Bitterwood report finding scattered stone foundations hidden beneath layers of moss and fallen timber, the only remaining physical evidence of the Pendleton family compound. Rusted metal fragments occasionally surface among the debris, pieces of equipment that once served purposes too horrible to contemplate. These artifacts have become prized collectibles among those who specialize in macabre memorabilia, selling for substantial sums to private collectors who display them alongside other relics of American criminal history. The psychological legacy of the case has proven more persistent than its physical remains. Descendants of Bitterwood families who remained in the region after 1913 have passed down oral histories that differ significantly from the sanitized official accounts. These family stories speak of relatives who refused to eat meat for years after the discovery, of nightmares that plagued entire households, of a collective trauma that influenced dietary habits and social behaviors for generations. More disturbing are the reports from modern residents of the area who claim to experience inexplicable cravings when visiting certain locations in the abandoned town site. Several individuals have described overwhelming urges to consume meat, particularly cuts that possess the tenderness and flavor that old-timers remember from the Pendleton shop. These accounts, while impossible to verify scientifically, have contributed to local legends about the spiritual contamination of land that witnessed such profound violations of human taboo. When we strip away the sensational details of the Pendleton case, when we look beyond the horrific mechanics of their operation and the gruesome specifics of their crimes, we are left with a truth that cuts far deeper than any cleaver ever could. The most terrifying aspect of this story was not the actions of two deranged brothers, but the willing participation of an entire community that chose comfort over conscience, appetite over inquiry, and convenience over compassion. For 15 years, the citizens of Bitterwood consumed human flesh, not because they were forced to, not because they were deceived by elaborate trickery, but because the meat tasted good, and asking questions might have threatened their access to something they had grown to crave. They witnessed the disappearances, they noted the convenient timing of fresh deliveries, they heard the whispered concerns of men like Reverend Clark, and they chose to ignore every warning sign in favor of maintaining their culinary satisfaction. The horror was not that monsters existed among them, but that ordinary people became monsters through a series of small compromises, tiny moral surrenders that accumulated over time until they had traveled so far from their original ethical positions that they could no longer recognize themselves. Each exceptional meal made the next disappearance easier to dismiss. Each convenient explanation made the subsequent mystery more acceptable, until the entire community had become complicit in an atrocity that none of them would have believed themselves capable of supporting. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor did it require dramatic conversion experiences or overt moral corruption. Instead, it unfolded through the gradual erosion of curiosity, the systematic suppression of uncomfortable questions, and the collective decision to prioritize immediate gratification over difficult truths. The townspeople became cannibals not through conscious choice, but through willful ignorance, eating human flesh while maintaining the fiction that they were consuming ordinary beef. The Pendleton brothers understood this fundamental weakness in human nature and exploited it with clinical precision. They recognized that people will accept almost any explanation for something they want to believe, and that communities will protect institutions that provide them with tangible benefits, regardless of the moral costs involved. Their genius was not in the mechanics of murder and butchery, but in their psychological manipulation of an entire population. The legacy of Bitterwood serves as a reminder that evil rarely announces itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious warning signs. More often, it creeps into our lives wearing familiar faces and offering attractive bargains, asking only that we refrain from asking too many questions or examining our choices too closely. The most profound moral failures occur not in moments of dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of small acceptances, minor compromises, and convenient blindness. If you've made it this far in our journey through one of history's darkest corners, consider subscribing to explore more stories that reveal the shadows hiding behind seemingly ordinary communities. The true price of a full belly was a hollowed-out soul.